All that glitters is not gold. It's an old proverb, still in use, and that cyclically, in news events or in human history, finds confirmation. After all, proverbs are little pearls of popular wisdom, and we could apply this particular proverb even to a pontificate, yes, to a pope, a representative of Christ on earth, vicar of Christ, successor of Peter. Call it what you want. This pope has led a very long pontificate, almost 27 years, a very long period, and therefore has gone through an extremely complex era. But he was also a pope who is remembered today for all the good he has done, who has been elevated to the honors of the altars by the ecclesiastical hierarchy, but whose figure retains here and there stains, points of shadow, circumstances in which clarity is lacking. Sometimes the will to shed full light is lacking, or the elements to have a complete picture of the situation are missing. This pope, this pontiff, was named Karol Wojtyla, better known as John Paul II, and this video is dedicated precisely to the attempt to shed light on all the shadow cones of his very long pontificate. First of all, a warning, this is not a biography of Karol Wojtyla. It does not want to be, and it will not be. This is an attempt at analysis, an analysis that starts from many, many, many questions. Questions to which we do not have answers. Did Karol Wojtyla know, and if he knew, why did he confront it this way? And if he didn't know, why didn't he ask for information? And if in the end he knew, and in part he didn't know or imagined or wasn't sure why, did he make certain choices? Choices that weigh on many, many, many people, that have led to suffering, that have legitimized dictators, and not only, that have also caused financial collapses. Why? And why doesn't the Catholic Church give clear answers today? Why does the Church still not clarify, does not shed light, but prefers to entrench itself behind the memory of what good Karol Wojtyla did and of his human suffering, of the last very difficult years of his pontificate, accompanied by physical suffering, illness, and finally death? Why? The pontificate of Karol Wojtyla, which began in 1978, succeeding Albino Luciani, the smiling pope, the pope who died just a few weeks after his own election, was characterized, at least for the first 12 years, by a strong geopolitical commitment, a commitment in the heart of the Cold War, a commitment that the Polish Pope, as he was called at the beginning, wanted to turn into a direct confrontation with Poland from where he came. It's no secret that during the early 80s, as repression in Poland became increasingly violent, Wojtyla himself wanted to press on Western governments for something to happen. He had even threatened Wojtyla to move the entire Vatican temporarily to Krakow, thus forcing the Western powers to shield him. It could have been the start of a Third World War. Fortunately, it did not happen. Yet the fervent anti-communism of Karol Wojtyla led to certain situations that we still struggle to explain today. Think about South America, that huge, vast subcontinent, and strongly Catholic, a subcontinent that from the late 60s, early 70s, until the late 80s had become a sort of huge continuous dictatorship. In 1987, a pastoral visit by Wojtyla to Santiago, Chile, had become an occasion for legitimizing Augusto Pinochet, who 14 years earlier had bloodily suppressed Chilean democracy, the fragile Chilean democracy, with the famous coup of September 11th that had cost the life of President Salvador Allende. Wojtyla could not have been unaware of what had happened, how Pinochet had taken power and how he exercised it. Several biographers, some Vatican sources, would later try to rewrite history. They would speak of a Wojtyla tricked by Pinochet, a Wojtyla deceived, convinced at the last minute to have photos taken while shaking hands with the dictator, even though deep down he did not respect him. But other sources deny all of this. There are documents, letters written by Wojtyla to Pinochet in 1993 for greetings, and later, some years after, following the arrest in Great Britain, with the extradition request from the Spanish government, which denied the fact that Wojtyla did not know Pinochet was in the dark about what he had done, or that he had been tricked anyway. And another stain is that of Bishop Oscar Romero, the Salvadoran bishop, standard bearer of the theology of liberation, that strong current of the Catholic Church in South America, in Central America, which proposed itself as a salvific proposal towards the poor people who fought against hunger and against dictatorships. An evangelical reading away from the halls of power is reported among the last, among the needy. A reading, however, that was not pleasing to other ecclesiastical spheres, and even less to the pontiff himself, who, on several occasions, had admonished Oscar Romero, who was Bishop of San Salvador, to show greater closeness and understanding towards a brutal government like the Salvadoran one. And nothing had happened at the Vatican, not even when assassins sent by Major d'Aubuisson, the leader of the extremist Arena Party, as well as commander of the death squads in San Salvador, had entered the Cathedral of San Salvador one Sunday in the middle of a religious service and had shot and killed Oscar Romero in the head. Nothing, no reaction. Why? Because Romero was seen as a subversive, a sympathizer of communism, in short, an internal adversary. Better not to deal with the matter. And this fervent anti-communism of John Paul II had also led him to make other questionable choices, which certainly does not mean that they were correct, regardless, perhaps justifiable from a certain perspective, but very, very hard to swallow. Think about the Ambrosiano scandal. Sometime after the outbreak of the scandal, the businessman Francesco Pazienza, whom we have already met in one of our videos dedicated to his latest autobiography, admitted the Vatican's involvement in the scandal itself. He admitted that the money embezzled from Lambrosiano, over $1 billion at the time, had been taken to be sent to Poland in support of Solidarność, the Catholic union led by Lech Wałęsa, the welder from Danzig, to oppose the regime of General Jaruzelski. Although the purpose was noble, it must be said that that money was not the Vatican's. That money was not Karol Wojtyla's. That money belonged to many different entities. Yes, they also belonged to the Mafia, which used D'Ambrosiano to launder some of its proceeds. The Mafia, the Magliana gang, Licio Gelli, the head of P2, but also to many Italian savers who suddenly found themselves in crisis. Is it possible that Karol Wojtyla knew nothing, didn't know who Roberto Calvi was, who he associated with, what his methods were? The text mentions his goals, his bishop's actions, and a Mr. Marcinkus who was previously introduced. We've already dedicated a video on the channel that you can review. Is it possible that he didn't know? Is it possible that he didn't know that Marcinkus had signed letters of patronage that admitted ownership on behalf of the Institute for the Works of Religion, the Institute for the Works of Religion of the Galaxy, of Panamanian companies that had received continuous shares from the foreign galaxy of Ambrosiano to start, from the Commercial de Nicaragua, from the Ambrosiano Bank, Andino in Peru, and from the Ambrosiano Overseas Limited Bank in Nassau in the Bahamas? Is it possible that Karol Wojtyla did not know, and if he did not know, for what reason? A year later, the same Wojtyla proclaimed an extraordinary holy year, a jubilee. When the last jubilee was held in 1975, the jubilees were born in the Middle Ages to replenish the coffers of the Vatican state. They had invented plenary indulgences, the possibility of obtaining through an obviously expensive pilgrimage, a washing away of sins. Here the pilgrimages, those holy years, those jubilees that were supposed to be held every 50 years, however, have become a 25-year deadline, but with exceptions because the Pope was allowed to proclaim some extraordinary ones. Well, a year after the Ambrosian crash, here is the extraordinary jubilee, perhaps because in the meantime, John Paul II had decided to donate a few $1 million to the cause of the failed Ambrosian, for this was the official justification to alleviate the sufferings of the poor savers who had been victims of the crash, and to corroborate this cash outflow, here comes an extraordinary jubilee. Can we then say that Karol Wojtyla knew nothing? Difficult. I don't feel like saying he knew nothing. And then there are other issues. Emanuela Orlandi, a Vatican citizen, vanished in Rome at 15 years old, leaving no trace. A story that has been talked about for a long time. It has been talked about again recently. A story with too many dark sides, with too many shadowy areas, and with the involvement of many ambiguous characters. With the shadow of Renatino de Pedic's Magliana gang, the shadow of the Grey Wolves, of the attacks suffered by John Paul II himself in St. Peter's Square in Rome. In 81, the figure of the so-called American, the telephone operator with a Yankee accent, who some believe was Marcinkus himself. A story that takes us back to that attack in the square, the attack carried out by Ali Hachka, a member of the Grey Wolves, the Turkish far-right organization, but said to be armed by the Bulgarian secret services, that is, by a satellite of the Soviet Union. Why? Because the Soviets themselves considered Karol Wojtyla a danger, and because the Bulgarians, perhaps to show off in a good light, had decided to let a somewhat crazy hitman with obvious protagonism do his thing. But that affair, the assassination attempt, then the Emanuele Orlandi affair, in the midst of the Institute for the Works of Religion, and then Pinochet, and even before Bishop Romero, does not exhaust the list of stains on the Pope's white robe. There are the pedophilia scandals that were already well known at the time, scandals that the Church had begun to suppress in various ways. And then there was acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, which made its thunderous appearance on the globe precisely in the 80s, and which will become a plague, a real pandemic, while all doctors ask for awareness campaigns to contain the spread of the infection also through the use of condoms. The Church, through its pontiff, that is Karol Wojtyla, opposes a series of no's. And these are no's that, especially in Africa, will cost millions of lives. Then there is Opus Dei, that congregation born from the reactionary Spanish priest, José María Escrivá de Balaguer, a priest who had already been absolved to the honors or dishonors of the Chronicles for having supported the Francoist dictatorship and for having clashed with a predecessor of Wojtyla on the throne of Peter, namely Pope Paul VI Pope Montini. Escrivá de Balaguer, after the conclave, exclaimed, "Damn and burn in hell," to anyone who voted for Montini, who was seen by the founder of Opus as an enemy, partly because of his extremely moderate positions, partly because Montini had refused the obra, already at the time, the status of personal prelature. Well, the status would have been attributed by Wojtyla, who perhaps burnt by the attack, perhaps frightened because he realized he could no longer trust anyone within the Vatican, perhaps because he was disoriented by what had happened between the Ambrosiano and the Eeyore. At a certain point he had given in. He had decided to give the agonized personal prelature to the obra, which from that moment on would become increasingly powerful and increasingly arrogant. That is another great, very great stain as far as the Pontificate of Wojtyla is concerned, a stain that also accompanies two beatification processes, always decided by the Polish Pope, that of Pius IX, a pontiff who had defended the dogma of the Pope's infallibility, but who, even worse, was accused of sympathies towards slavery, anti-Semitism, and tyranny. Pius IX had been the last Pope King, and as such had behaved by distributing excommunications abundantly, signing very harsh encyclicals, not only against the liberal European societies of the time, but also against the pushes towards the abolition of slavery, and who had remained far from a serene relationship with those who would have been called the elder Jewish brothers. The other beatification process that met with various dubious faces, not to mention criticisms, was that of Monsignor Aloisio Stepinas, the former bishop of Zagreb, accused of sympathies towards Nazism, and even of connivance towards the Ustasha regime. During the studies of the beatification process of Stepanak, indeed several scholars brought to Wojtyla's knowledge what had happened in the enormous complex of the former Jasenovac concentration camp, the hell on earth in the Balkans. A camp that had been managed for a while, even by a friar, Father Miroslav Filipovich Majstorovic, also called Fra Demonio. The Pope could not have been unaware. He could not ignore the fact that Stepanak had partly covered up everything that had happened during the Ustasha regime. It's true that there has been a long debate about whether Stepanak was really the arch-villain of genocide, or if he was misunderstood, if his attempts to save Jews were sincere, or just attempts at forced conversion, just as it had been with the Orthodox Serbs forced to abjure and embrace Catholic Christianity. But Karol Wojtyla, in this case too, turned a deaf ear. He didn't care about everything that was happening. He didn't care about the criticisms, the warnings. He didn't even care about the research of historians who warned him even about Father Miroslav Draganovic, whom we have already talked about, who facilitated the escape of the Ustasha to South America. He didn't care, and he would continue on his path. So, taking stock, what was the pontificate of John Paul II? It was a complex pontificate, a pontificate that accompanied the process of glasnost and perestroika in the East, a process, however, created by Mikhail Gorbachev. It was a pontificate that saw the fall of the bipolar world, a pontificate that, at a certain point, took a firm stand against the mafias, with a clear, powerful, and courageous speech by Wojtyla himself in Sicily against the bosses. But it was also a pontificate accompanied by many, many, many stains. Stains that remain indelible, just like the questions. Why? Why certain choices? Why defend tyrants like Pinochet? Why not save Oscar Romero? Why let the Ambrosiano affair degenerate? Why Emanuele Orlandi? Why the attack? Why the beatifications? Why? These are questions to which we cannot have answers, for reasons you know. But allow me a reflection. As mentioned, Pope Pius IX was a strange defender of the dogma of the Pope's infallibility. But the dogma has nothing divine about it. Dogma is a man's invention who decides of his own accord to corroborate the divine message with his own contribution. A bit like mixing water with wine. We know what happens. It changes. The initial purity changes, and that's what happened. Karol Wojtyla was not infallible. He was not a deity, and like all men, like all human beings, he was subject to original sin, that of error, and he made many mistakes. He obviously did great things. He did a lot for many, but in other cases he did nothing, or did less than he could have done, or did something contrary to what would have been right. Like all men, he made mistakes, but rightly, to understand a historical figure, we cannot stop at the merits. We must analyze it all around, even in the inconsistencies. Only in this way can we understand the personality, the person, the role, and the period he lived in. Only in this way can we, perhaps even in the future, better understand all of human history.